All right, so I'm going to try something a little different. This is a weird idea that I had, and I want to see how it works. I have two videos, and each video supports one side of an argument. But I'm not going to tell you which video is which until we get to the actual argument. Up until that point, I am just going to establish the framework. I'm going to talk about everything that you kind of have to agree upon, and then we go from there. So you won't get the big reveal until a certain moment. I'm going to put a timestamp on the video, and it should be the same for each video, but from that point forward, the paths, they diverge. And one argument is for Jesus' resurrection, and the other is against Jesus' resurrection. You're not really going to know which video you're watching until we get to the argument. So let's start with something that I think will genuinely surprise you, which is that Jesus of Nazareth was not a particularly interesting person for a lot of historians. I know that sounds crazy because he's kind of like the biggest deal ever. He's bigger than the Beatles, I would argue. He lived for roughly 33 years. He had no political office, no army, no territory. He wrote nothing. He was publicly executed as a criminal and as a political threat. There were many men that were claiming to be the Messiah at that time. He was not the only one. And a lot of these other men were also put to death. However, none of these other men carry the same historical significance. By every measure that the ancient world used to track who matters, Jesus should have disappeared completely within a generation of his death, just like all these other so-called messiahs. However, that didn't happen, and that is worth investigating. So before I argue about what happened and what the argument is one way or the other, before we get into resurrection or no resurrection, did it happen? Was it a miracle, crazy hallucination, or whatever it was? Let's look at what the historical records give us, because it gives us less than what most people think, and also more than what I think most people realize. So let's talk about, first and foremost, the non-Christian writers. These are basically any texts that are outside of the Bible. There are a handful of non-Christian writers who mention Jesus and early Christians. And here are just a few of them. There's a guy named Tacitus, and he wrote something around 116 AD. He was a Roman senator, he was a historian, and he was not a fan of Christians or Christianity. He described it explicitly as a destructive superstition. But however, in writing about the persecution of Christians, he did mention that Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate. That's it. Execution, no miracles, no resurrection, no theological claims. Just the fact that he died. That's all he mentioned. Then there's Pliny the Younger, who wrote around 112 AD, and he was a Roman governor, and he was writing to the emperor at the time about how to deal with Christians in his province. He describes them as gathering before dawn to sing hymns to Christ as a god. He essentially was asking, should I murder all of these people? Again, he didn't really say anything about Jesus' life, only that his followers, decades after his death, worshipped him as divine. Then there was Suetonius, whose writing is from around 121 AD. He mentions that the Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome over disturbances involving Christ. Most historians think that this is a garbled reference to Jesus. It is honestly genuinely ambiguous though. Then there is Lucian of Samosata. I think that's how you pronounce it. I have no idea. He had some writing around 165 AD, and he was a satirist who mocked everybody, but he did confirm a few things about Jesus, that he was a teacher, he was crucified, and people worshipped him afterwards. So the non-Christian writers here, they established this, that Jesus was a real person and that he was executed under Pontius Pilate, and that afterwards he had some devoted followers who considered him a god, which is a solid baseline. But there are no miracle claims, there are no resurrection claims, just the fact of the person and death. And this is the most important source, Josephus. This is where things get interesting. Josephus was a first century Jewish historian. He was born around 37 AD and died around 100 AD. He was a Jewish priest. He fought as a commander in the Jewish revolt against Rome. He was captured, and then, in a move his contemporaries considered treason, he became a client and apologist of the Roman Emperor Vespasian. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He spent the rest of his life in Rome. His major works were the Jewish War and the Antiquities of the Jews. It was a sweeping history of the Jewish people from the creation onto his own time. He wrote as a Jew explaining Judaism to a Roman audience. He was not a Christian, and he makes that very clear in his writings. He never converted to Christianity. And here's what matters about his writing style. He was very careful. He hedges, he qualifies, he notes uncertainty when he feels it and when he sees it. He presents multiple accounts and lets the reader decide. He does not force any conclusions. When he writes about Herod the Great, a man he clearly dislikes, he is precise, occasionally sarcastic, but he's always measured. When he covers events he personally witnessed, including brutal military losses, he's actually very analytical. He does not write like a devotional pamphlet. So keep that in mind when I read the next thing that I'm about to read. Because in the Antiquity of the Jews, Book 18, there is a passage. It is the single most cited non-biblical reference to Jesus in all of ancient literature. And it goes like this. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many Jew and Gentile. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again in the third day, as the divine prophets have foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the herd of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. So this is a powerful little chunk of text here, because this pretty much says that this guy was resurrected. And this is coming from a historian outside of the Bible. If it be lawful to call him a man is one of the things that is in this little chunk of text. And also, he was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again in the third day. Those three little chunks are very, very strange. Because Josephus, a practicing Jew, writing for a Roman emperor who was never converted to Christianity, is apparently declaring that Jesus was not possibly human, but was also definitely the Messiah and literally rose from the dead. This passage was edited, most certainly by Christian scribes, sometime around the 3rd or 4th century. It's just, there's no dispute here. Somebody went back and changed this. First, the tone. It's completely wrong. This reads like a devotional pamphlet. Every other thing that this man writes about religious figures is measured, analytical, and skeptical. But this little passage, for whatever reason, is not. And that should raise a red flag. Also, the handwriting doesn't match. Secondly, the first person who quotes this passage as it is generations away from when this was written. Nobody else quotes this passage until way later. And if this passage originally said what it did, people would have been quoting it. It would have been quite a crazy claim, and it would have been the crown jewel of early Christian apologetics, yet no one mentions it. Also, we have another version that doesn't say this, because if you look at his Arabic translation of the same text, it contains a completely different account of what's going on. Instead, it's a little bit more careful with its words. Pilates condemned him to be crucified and die. Talking about Jesus, of course. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders. There's a difference here, because this is just saying, perhaps, we don't know. This is what his disciples are saying, but we have no way of knowing this for sure. And this really aligns with the way Josephus would have written this passage. And even that, I will say, is a pretty extraordinary claim that there's a group of people going around saying that Jesus rose from the dead. However, there's a big difference between what that first chunk of text said and this one. Here's the thing. What do we actually get from Josephus? It's probably this. Jesus was notable enough to include. He called him a wise man. He noted his crucifixion, noted the movement that formed afterwards, but that's it. And he did that because he's a serious historian. So what does this mean if we know it was edited? It means that the evidence for the resurrection in the historical record is not as clean as it is sometimes presented. The text came to us through people who cared deeply about what those texts said, and sometimes they would edit them accordingly. We know this to be true. Now let's talk about what's probably authentic. Josephus gave us one reference to Jesus that almost all scholars do consider genuine. In Antiquities, Book 20, he refers briefly to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. Passing mention. That's it. The passage is actually about James's execution by the high priest. And it's very interesting here because the high priest gets in trouble for actually allowing this execution. And that's what Josephus is focused on, not Jesus. He mentions Jesus's brother in a very passing way. That's it. He does not go into this Christ fellow. Though I will say that obviously there was some crazy stuff going on in Jerusalem at that time. It was just so much, and this just didn't seem like anything extraordinary to any of the historians at the time, because this kind of stuff was happening all over the place at the time. So this is the thing about Josephus, is that he actually kind of just focuses on Roman rulers and important figures to the Roman people. Jesus just wasn't significant because this whole Messiah thing that was going on, there were tons of people running around saying that they were the Messiah at that time. So it wasn't very noteworthy to him. There were bigger and more important things in his mind going on when it came to just the rule of Rome and how politics were shifting at that time. But I think what's also important is that scholars pretty much agree that that one passage is authentic. But also it's important to note that there was no resurrection account. So I want to make sure that we can all agree on the same things before we move forward. If you believe that the Bible hasn't been edited, I can't help you here, because if you open up your Bible, almost every translation, you go to Mark chapter 16, verses 9 and onward were added later. This is something every Bible just directly in it should probably say. I can't think of a translation that doesn't include some sort of footnote saying like, hey, this stuff, it was added later. If you can't admit that the Bible was in fact altered after its original authorship, I can't help you here. It's in the Bible. And if you don't believe what's in the Bible about the Bible, I don't know. I guess, this video isn't for you. But that is one of the things that I'm saying, is that there are a lot of texts, just like Josephus, that were edited after the fact for one reason or another. That really shouldn't be that controversial of a statement. It's in your Bibles. It says it right there. But let's talk about some other stuff that I think we all need to agree is common ground. The resurrection debate tends to get conducted as if one side has all the evidence and the other is just wishful thinking, but I don't think that's true in either direction. What actually exists is a shared set of historical data points that virtually all serious historians, Christians, Jewish, atheists, agnostic, they all agree on these data points. The disagreement is about what those data points may mean. So here are the things that I would say are never going to be seriously disputed when it comes to Jesus' resurrection. So 1, Jesus was crucified. It's confirmed by the Gospels, Paul's letters. It's also confirmed by external sources. This is about as historically certain as anything gets when it comes to this argument. Jesus was a person and he got crucified. If you can't agree to that, I can't help you. 2, his followers very soon afterwards believed that he had risen from the dead. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, one of the earliest documents in the entire New Testament, written roughly 20 years after the crucifixion, he gives a list of people that Jesus had appeared to after his death. First, there's Peter. And Peter was kind of the leader of the Christian movement at that time before he was put to death. Then there was James, and James was the brother of Jesus, who originally was skeptical, but then converts after Jesus' death. Something happens to make this man believe that Jesus is God. Then there's Paul. who actively persecuted the early church before his conversion on the road to Damascus. These are named individuals. The 500, we don't really know. And then the apostles, we do have an account for in later gospels that go into more detail. They give an account saying that Jesus was resurrected. Let's see. Something reverses the trajectory of this movement. A crucified Messiah in first century Jewish context was a failed Messiah, full stop. There was a list of criteria that a Messiah had to meet. And if a Messiah dies before he accomplishes the things that he's set to accomplish, rebuilding the temple, there's a whole list. If he dies before that happens, he's not the Messiah. A crucifixion specifically nullifies that claim. It's a divine curse in Deuteronomy. So for Jesus to be crucified, he's like super disqualified. However, the execution of Jesus, which should have ended this movement that he is the Messiah, as it ended every other Messiah claim during that period of time, instead, within weeks, the movement explodes across the Roman world. And that does require some explanation. Why did that happen? And I'm not saying anything at this point. We just have to agree something had to have happened for this movement to explode the way that it did. I'm just saying this so far, these have been the facts. If you want to contest these facts, that's a different video. That's not this video. I'm saying that both sides have to admit that those are truths. Because if you can't admit to that, I can't help you. So the problem is what do these three things mean? We have that Jesus was crucified. His followers very soon believed he had risen from the dead, and that something reversed the trajectory of the movement after he was crucified. I do want to say, before I get into the arguments, that both arguments I think are made very seriously. They both take evidence seriously, and they share a lot of conclusions in the same ways, but there's obviously a big difference between the two. All right, you're watching Video B. Video B means you're about to hear the case for the resurrection being true. This is the argument that when you evaluate the historical evidence carefully, the resurrection remains the most complete explanation of what actually happened. The skeptical case is coherent and it's reasonable, but coherent and reasonable is not the same as the best explanation of the facts. Something can be coherent and reasonable and wrong. For something so extraordinary to have happened, it would not have been accounted for in an ordinary way. That just wouldn't make sense. So let's talk about the tampering, because it really cuts both ways here. When we're talking about what happened, when someone edited Josephus's work to make him say Jesus rose from the dead, you can argue that the evidence is tainted, and that's totally fair. But think about what the tampering implies. If Christian scribes felt the need to edit Josephus to insert that he was the Christ, he appeared to them alive on the third day, it means the original text didn't say those things. The authentic Josephus, the pre-edited version, apparently mentions Jesus without affirming the resurrection. And that is the expected move for a unsympathetic historian. Josephus mentions Jesus the way a reporter covers a local story. He was a figure. Here's what happened to him. Here's the movement that resulted. No endorsement. But here's what Josephus also doesn't do. He doesn't deny it. What he doesn't say is that the resurrection story is fabricated. He doesn't engage with the counter-narrative that the Jewish authorities were apparently circulating. Matthew 28 references a claim that the disciples stole the body. Josephus doesn't mention that. He doesn't refute that. He doesn't even acknowledge that. This is a historian writing within the memory of the events, writing in the city where the events occurred with access to Jewish priestly sources who would have known every detail of the counter-narrative and every reason to circulate it. The silence of Josephus, a hostile, non-Christian, well-connected historian who covered this period extensively, is notable. He doesn't confirm the resurrection, no, but he doesn't deny it either. And he could have. He absolutely could have. The earliness of all of this is the hardest fact to dismiss. There are people who say that the story gets more miraculous over time, which is true. As the edits get added and added and added, there is more whimsy about the story of Jesus, and there is more theology. The claims just get bigger and bigger. In 1 Corinthians 15, the list of people that Jesus appeared to, there's Peter, there's the 12, the 500, James, Paul. It was not invented by Paul. Paul explicitly says that he received that list. He was told that this was something that was already circulating. This means that everyone who believed that Jesus has rose from the dead was being told this as well. This was kind of part of the package at this point. This information was circulating at the same time in the same cadence as the claim that Jesus had been resurrected and has risen from the dead. This information probably came about just a few years after Jesus' death. This is not the same as a legend, because legends take generations to develop, and there were already things that were very solid in the account of Jesus' resurrection. Probably the closest thing we have to a primary source is what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 15. Then, Paul tells us in Galatians 1 that he met with Peter and James in Jerusalem roughly 3 years after his conversion, putting that meeting in the mid-30s AD. He is talking to people in the creed, the named witnesses, and they're still alive. The events they are describing happened in the same city within living memory of one another, where anyone could investigate them and where the Jewish and Roman authorities had every reason and want to. The skeptical account requires that these early intense structured beliefs had to have emerged entirely from these grief-induced visions. And it all had to have happened within a few years of this event among people who knew each other in a city that was actively hostile towards these claims. And that's possible, but it requires a lot of simultaneous, rapid, coordinated transformations. Something happened quickly. That cannot be argued. But the question is what? What I will say is that these witnesses had every reason not to believe. So first and foremost, James. He was Jesus' brother. The Gospels record that Jesus' own family, including his brothers, thought he had gone nuts during his ministry. James was not a follower, and then something happened. And James became not just a believer, but the leader of the Jerusalem church. And Josephus even states that he was eventually executed by the high priest because of what he was claiming, that Jesus was God. He didn't drift towards this belief. He jumped completely headfirst into it, and he gave up his life for it, which is significant. He was willing to die for this belief. Paul was also in a very similar boat. He started out very hostile. He was violently persecuting the Christians and trying to destroy the entire movement. And he did a complete 180. He had so many investments in not believing, and then he gave up everything to believe. And the grief hypothesis that this was just a grief-induced vision, it doesn't fully explain Saul. Something changed his mind completely. And for the rest of his life, he suffered because of it. And then one of the most overlooked details about the resurrection accounts is how many of the disciples were initially skeptical. The Gospels don't hide it. Thomas refuses to believe until he sees it. Matthew records that at the final appearance in Galilee, some still doubted. Luke describes the disciples' initial reaction to the woman's report as an idle tale. They did not believe the women. A manufactured story doesn't include the founding figures doubting. That just doesn't bode well. The presence of recorded doubt suggests the accounts preserve something of what actually happened, including the messy, confusing, contested quality of the early experiences. And what I will say is that the other argument has a lot of work to do. It has a lot of heavy lifting. Let's be honest about that. Grief visions are common, first and foremost. Yes, they're real, but the appearance to 500 does not describe a private interior experience. Even granting everything the other argument has about individual grief visions, 500 people simultaneously experiencing the same hallucination is a little off kilter. For 500 people to have experienced the same hallucination, all agreed that they saw the same thing, is wild. If Jesus did appear to 500 people, Grief is not the explanation. It is not a vision. Something else happened. And let's talk about the stolen body hypothesis. Let's just say that if the disciples stole the body and then proclaimed the resurrection, knowing it was false, they then invented a lie that they died for. And I don't mean metaphorically. They actually did. Peter was crucified upside down. Paul was beheaded. James was stoned to death. People maintain conspiracies under pressure when there's something to gain. But these disciples didn't gain anything. They gained persecution. They gained poverty, imprisonment. They gained death. Liars don't typically hold the line under those conditions indefinitely. They all held to the same lie? That seems crazy. Also, the wrong tomb hypothesis, that the women went to the wrong tomb in the dark. This requires that nobody ever checked the right one and produced the body, even as the resurrection claims spread rapidly through the city where the tomb was located. The Jewish authorities, who had every reason to crush the movement, never apparently considered the move. So none of these are impossible, but each one requires a string of additional assumptions that kind of all accumulate on top of each other. What we have is multiple accounts of a man 3 days after he's executed just showing up and appearing to both believers and skeptics, individually and in groups. We have named witnesses who stake their lives on those claims. We have a hostile witness who is transformed essentially inexplicably overnight on a road to Damascus. We have a movement in the very city where any disinformation could have been proven very quickly, within years of the event, while eyewitnesses were still alive, and that did not happen. The resurrection, well, extraordinary, explains this complete set of facts more fully than any alternative that has been seriously proposed, because the alternatives each leave something significant unexplained. And what I'll say about this argument is that I think this explains pretty much all the pieces the most completely. I think it may require some faith, but I think the alternatives leave a lot more unexplained. The resurrection does kind of explain all of it quite easily, at the cost of accepting something that doesn't happen in ordinary human experience. It's making a very extraordinary claim, but it is kind of the most conclusive, kind of wraps everything up quite nicely. Whether the cost of believing this is worth it ultimately is not a historical question, but now we're going to go to the shared conclusion. So here's where we are. A man named Jesus was executed. Can't dispute that. His followers, very soon after, believed he rose from the dead. Not disputed. There are named individuals who gave their life to claim that he is God. Not disputed. There are texts that say what happened, but we know that these texts are to some degree edited. That's also not disputed. But what is disputed is what we do with all of this. So both interpretations, if you watched both, whichever one you saw, were built on the same facts. They were arguing about evidence. They were arguing about what counts as a sufficient explanation. One option says that Greek psychology, evolving tradition, it's sufficient. It explains everything without requiring a miracle. The other option says that resurrection, a miracle, explains everything. The resurrection is the more complete explanation. Neither of those positions are unreasonable. That's kind of where I find most of my uncomfort here. This isn't a case where one side has the evidence and the other has wishful thinking. Both sides are reasoning carefully from the same data and reaching different conclusions. So, to me, what that means is this. At a certain point, this stops being a question about evidence, and it becomes a question about what kind of world you think you live in. If you already believe the universe is the kind of place where God acts in history, where resurrection is possible, where the extraordinary can happen, the evidence is more than sufficient. It's compelling, actually. If you believe the universe is the kind of place where the dead stay dead and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, the evidence, while interesting, isn't enough, not even close. Neither of those is a belief. You arrive at by just reading history. Both of them are prior commitments that you bring to history, which I believe means that neither the believer nor the skeptic can claim their position is purely evidence-based. Both are making a judgment call here about something the evidence cannot settle, which brings me to the strangest thing about faith. Faith is not the absence of evidence, and it's not the presence of certainty. It's the choice that you make in the space where the evidence runs out. When you've looked at everything available and you still have to decide, that is when faith steps in. So here is the most honest thing I can say. I personally don't know if Jesus rose from the dead. And if you're being honest with yourself, if you really look at yourself, if you really look inside, neither do you. You don't know. You can't know. I don't know. I can't know. None of us can know. Not because the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? It's not because that question doesn't matter. It matters greatly. But because it's the kind of question that sits on the edge of what human research can do, on what history can do, on what evidence can do. What we have is not enough to produce any certainty, one way or the other. And everything beyond that edge has a different name. You can believe or you cannot believe, but both choices are made in the same place.